All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the hidden world of financial crime. We're going to explore how criminals move their money, what really drives them, and the clever methods they use to operate deep in the shadows of our global economy.
It sounds like a pretty good problem to have, right? But for a criminal, a huge pile of cash is actually a massive headache. You can't just waltz into a car dealership and buy a Lamborghini with a suitcase full of bills, or deposit $1 million from, say, drug sales into a bank account. That's going to raise a whole lot of red flags. And this is what kicks off our whole story.
And here is the criminal's solution: money laundering. It's really just a fancy term for taking dirty money, cash from illegal activities, and running it through a sort of financial car wash. The whole goal is to make it come out looking sparkling clean and legitimate, so it can be spent freely without anyone tracing it back to the original crime.
So how in the world do they actually do that? Well, it's not just one simple trick. It's a very deliberate, carefully structured process with a few key stages, all designed to make that money's dirty history just disappear.
It all starts with placement. This is where the physical cash gets into the system, maybe through a bunch of small deposits into different bank accounts. Then comes layering, and this is where it gets really complicated. They move the money around like crazy through tons of transactions to create a confusing, tangled web that's almost impossible to follow. And finally, you have integration. The money, now looking totally clean, comes back into the regular economy, ready to be used to buy things like fancy cars, real estate, or businesses. Now, to pull all that off, criminals have a whole bag of tricks. They create shell companies that exist only on paper. They use legitimate front businesses, like a laundromat or a restaurant that handles a lot of cash, to mix the dirty money in with clean money. And they're always adapting, using everything from crypto and NFTs to the stock market and even high-value art and gold to hide their tracks. Okay, so we've seen the how, but what about the where? Where is all this illicit cash actually coming from? The answer is pretty sobering, because it connects this whole financial puzzle to very real and often very serious harm in the real world. The official term for the crime that actually creates the dirty money is a predicate crime. The easiest way to think about it is like this. The predicate crime is the original sin. The money laundering that comes after it is a totally separate secondary crime that's all about covering up the first one.
One of the biggest predicate crimes on the planet, hands down, is drug trafficking. The absolutely massive cash profits from selling illegal narcotics create this constant, huge demand for money laundering services. All that cash has to be cleaned before it can be used. And tragically, some of this money comes from an incredible amount of human suffering. Crimes like human trafficking and smuggling generate huge profits from exploiting and abusing vulnerable people. So when we talk about financial crime, it's so important to remember that it's not just numbers on a screen. It's often funding criminal groups that cause terrible harm. Money laundering isn't the only game in town when it comes to financial crime. There are other major crimes that are closely related but have very different goals and methods. Let's take a quick look at a couple of them. This is a really important distinction to make: the difference between money laundering and terrorism financing. With money laundering, the money starts out dirty, and the whole point is to hide its illegal origin. But with terrorism financing, the goal is to fund an illegal act. The money itself can actually start out clean, maybe from legitimate donations. The key difference is the intent. One is about hiding the past, the other is about funding the future. Another big one is sanctions evasion. So when individuals or even whole countries get hit with economic sanctions, they don't just throw their hands up and quit. No way. They get creative. They use all sorts of tricks, like hiding who really owns a superyacht through a maze of shell companies, or stripping key information from bank transfers so they can keep moving money and doing business in secret.
Okay, so theory is one thing, but let's see how this all works in the real world. This case study is a fantastic example of how criminals combine these different methods into one big operation.
So, let's talk about Yamel Guevara Tamayo. This guy wasn't working alone. He built a whole network of what are called money mules. These are people who, sometimes without even knowing it, use their own personal bank accounts to help criminals move dirty money around. His whole operation was connected to cybercrime and was surprisingly sophisticated. Now, in the United States, there's a magic number that every criminal knows and every bank watches like a hawk: $10,000. Any cash transaction over that amount gets automatically reported to the government. It's a huge red flag for law enforcement. So to get around that big, scary $10,000 limit, Tamayo's network didn't just make deposits of, say, $9,900. They were smarter than that. They used a technique called microstructuring. They had their mules make tons of tiny deposits, often less than $1,000 each. spread out across all kinds of different accounts to stay completely off the radar.
And this is a perfect real-world example of the layering stage we talked about. By having his mules bounce the money between different banks and even across international borders, Tamayo built that complex web. He made it incredibly difficult for investigators to connect the dots and trace the money back to the original cybercrime.
So far, we've really focused on the how and the what of financial crime. But to truly understand it, we need to dig a little deeper into the why. What actually goes on in a person's mind that leads them to commit fraud?
Well, criminologists have a really simple but powerful model for explaining this, and it's called the fraud triangle. It basically says that for most types of fraud to happen, you need 3 things to be present all at the same time.
First, you need pressure. This is the motivation. It could be massive debt, a gambling problem, or just intense pressure to hit a sales target. Next, you need opportunity. This is the opening, the weak spot in the system, like a lack of oversight that gives someone the chance to act. And finally, the third side of the triangle is rationalization. This is the story people tell themselves to make it okay. Things like, I'm just borrowing it, or the company owes me, or everyone else is doing it. You need all 3 for fraud to happen. Take away just one, and the whole triangle falls apart.
So we've covered a lot of ground, from the nitty-gritty mechanics of washing money to the very human psychology behind it. And that leaves us with a really big question to think about. Once you understand both how these crimes are committed and why people commit them, where do you even begin to try and stop it all? Thanks for digging into this with me today.